I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone here to this weekend Vipashyana retreat based on these 3 marks of existence. And this is the 4th in the series of 5 retreats, online retreats that we've been running, covering these 3 main areas of practice of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. So in the area of cultivating mindfulness, we did 2 weekend retreats, 2 shamatha retreats. The first one was focusing on mindfulness of breathing, and the second one was focusing on observing the mind. And then the last retreat we did, the last weekend retreat, was a compassion retreat based on the 4 immeasurables. And this is the first of 2 Vipashyana retreats, weekend retreats, focusing on the wisdom practice. And so here we see that there are sort of 2 main wings of practice within all Buddhist traditions of wisdom and compassion. And these are on the basis of shamatha practice, that first we cultivate a very calm, clear, focused mind. And then on that basis, we can more effectively engage in Vipashyana or insight practice and in cultivating the positive qualities in the compassion wing of practice. And we saw there that in the last retreat in the compassion wing, the foundation of the compassion wing are these 4 immeasurables. And then the Mahayana Buddhist traditions build on those 4 immeasurables into what's called bodhicitta. And we very briefly touched on that in the last retreat in terms of this exchanging self with others. And so here in the wisdom wing of practice, or Vipashyana practice, the foundation level here is the 3 marks of existence. This is the core of Vipashyana practice in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, and that's what we'll be covering in this weekend retreat. And then in the fifth and last retreat, the Vipassana retreat on emptiness, is where we look at the emptiness Vipassana practices, where the Mahayana Buddhist traditions build on those on the 3 marks of existence in terms of emptiness. So these are how all these 5 retreats are sort of fit together in terms of a whole system of practice covering these 3 core areas of practice of shamatha, Vipassana, and compassion. And in this weekend retreat, we'll be doing 3 sessions each day. In the previous retreats, we've been doing 4, but here we're condensing down into 3 sessions each day. Today, we're going to begin with an introduction in the first session. Then in the following 2 sessions today, we'll be looking at the Vipassana or insight practice into impermanence in terms of body and then the mind. And then tomorrow, the first session will be looking at the insight into suffering. And then the last 2 sessions focusing on the insight into no self. So each of the sessions today and tomorrow will be 1 hour 15 long, and we'll have a 30-minute break between each of the sessions. So today and tomorrow will then finish at 1:45 in the afternoon. That's Central European summer time. The structure of the sessions will be as per the previous retreats. We'll begin with a guided meditation. Then there'll be a presentation about that particular topic for that session, another guided meditation, and then we'll finish with some question answer at the end of the session. In terms of question answer, we'll do as we've done in the earlier retreats. You've got 2 options here that you can either when we have Q&A session, you can either unmute and switch on your webcam and ask the question directly, or anytime during the session, if you prefer, you can type your question into the chat box, and then Daniel, who's helping out in this retreat, he'll read out your questions at the end of the session. So you've got both of those choices in terms of asking questions. The recommended reading for this retreat is Minding Closely, another book from Alan Wallace, covering these 4 applications of mindfulness that we're covering in this weekend retreat. So let's begin the first session now, and we'll begin with a sort of an introduction into Vipassana practice in general, and then a bit of a background into the context for Vipassana practice as well. We'll begin with a meditation just to simply settle our body, speech, and mind, and to set a good motivation for this weekend retreat. Then we'll begin with a basic introduction into what is Vipassana, why is Vipassana practice important? And then we'll have a look at the sort of the overview of Vipassana practice. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the context in which we are doing Vipassana practice, the larger framework within which Vipassana practice fits. And for this, we'll be looking at the Four Noble Truths. It's the sort of foundation of all Buddhist traditions, and it really gives the fundamental framework for Vipassana practice. And then we'll look at the actual practice. We'll start the Vipassana practice of impermanence, focusing on the body already in this introductory session. And we'll continue that practice in the next session as well. And then time for some question answer at the end of the session. So let's begin with meditation. So we'll do a short meditation to simply settle body, speech, and mind, relax the body, relax the mind, and then also setting a good motivation for this weekend retreat. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body, right down to the ground. Becoming aware of the sensations where your body is touching the cushion or the chair. And then allow your awareness to rise up and fill the entire space of your body. And simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And bringing your awareness to the area of your face, and soften and relax all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And as part of the preparation, we can now take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allow the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then preparing the mind, not dwelling in the past, not anticipating the future. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Simply resting in that stillness of the present moment. Allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. And then simply become aware of the rhythm of your breath. Noticing if it's slow or fast, deep or shallow, long or short. Without trying to modify it in any way. So simply noticing the rhythm of your breath. And then think about your motivation for attending this weekend retreat, this Vipashyana retreat. And then set the best possible motivation you can for attending this weekend retreat. And try to include others in your motivation as well. And then keeping this motivation in mind, we can slowly finish the meditation and begin our discussions here today. So let's begin by asking the question, well, what is Vipassana? Vipassana is a Sanskrit term. The Pali equivalent is Vipassana. So when Buddhism spread from ancient India, it spread through these two languages of Sanskrit and Pali. Through the Sanskrit is the basis of what's called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, and the Pali is the basis of what's called the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And so here this term Vipassana is the Sanskrit and the Pali is Vipassana. And in this word, the VI prefix means higher or superior, and then Passana or Passana means to see. So literally higher seeing, seeing beyond. So this is often translated into English as special insight or simply insight. So Vipassana or Vipassana is the practice of gaining insight into the nature of reality by applying mindfulness to investigate the nature of reality. Why is Vipassana practice important? The Buddhist assertion is that the underlying source of our suffering is our mental afflictions, such as anger, jealousy, craving, anxiety, and so forth. And that our mental afflictions are coming from our distorted view of reality. And therefore, if we can gain insight into the nature of reality, then we can overcome our distorted view, our mental afflictions, and thereby overcome our suffering. And thereby achieve this state of genuine happiness and inner well-being. So that is the goal of Vipassana practice, to overcome mental afflictions and suffering and to achieve that genuine happiness, inner well-being. So quite important. Now we have a number of distorted views of reality. In this and the next retreat, we'll be looking at four main distorted views. The first is that we tend to see things which are changing as unchanging. The second is that we tend to equate pleasure as happiness, see pleasure as happiness. The third is we tend to see where there is no self, a self. And the fourth is we tend to see things which are dependent as independent. And so these distorted views lead to mental afflictions and suffering. And so therefore the insights that we are going to be cultivating in this and the next retreat is first the insight into impermanence, that everything's changing moment by moment. And we'll be looking at that in the following two sessions today. And then tomorrow we'll begin by looking at the insight into suffering. And then the next two sessions tomorrow, the insight into no self. And then we'll be spending a lot of time cultivating this insight into emptiness to overcome grasping onto things being independent. And that's in the next retreat. So therefore here, what we find is that when we talk about Vipassana practice, the Pali term from the Theravada Buddhist traditions, when they say they're doing Vipassana practice, then they're mainly talking about these first three insights into impermanence, suffering, and no self. And these three insights are called the three marks of existence. Whereas when we talk about doing Vipassana practice in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, then the three marks of existence are included, but we are mainly talking about this wisdom practice of emptiness, coming to realize emptiness. So when we use the word Vipassana, we're doing Vipassana practice. That's what mainly we're talking about in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. But here in this weekend retreat, we're going to be focusing on these 3 marks of existence. And mindfulness is key for this. So remember, in the shamatha practice, we were strengthening mindfulness, we're cultivating mindfulness. Because here in Vipassana practice, we then apply that mindfulness to investigate, to analyze, to question, to come to insights. And we do that through what's called the 4 applications of mindfulness. And so this is summarized in the recommended reading, the Minding Closely from Alan Wallace. On page 43, he says the following. He says, the 4 close applications of mindfulness constitute the bedrock of the Buddha's teachings on insight or Vipassana, optimally fused with meditative quiescence or shamatha in a mind finely honed in attention and samadhi. Classically speaking, one is cultivating the mental faculty known as mindfulness. In Sanskrit, that is smrti, in Pali, sati, along with its corollary, introspection, this quality control. So we saw that they were the 2 main tools in shamatha practice, holding the object with a rope, with the rope of mindfulness, and then using the hook of introspection, quality control. And then he goes on to say, observing the breath might sound boring, but the development of attention skills is not done for entertainment. These practices stabilize and enhance the quality of attention. The principal method to shape, refine, and polish mindfulness is the practice of shamatha. Both mindfulness and introspection are developed in shamatha and utilized, or in other words, applied closely in the 4 close applications of mindfulness. So here, therefore, we are applying mindfulness through what's called the 4 applications of mindfulness. We're applying mindfulness by investigating 4 things. We're investigating first our body, then feelings, and feelings here doesn't mean emotions, it means simply pleasant, unpleasant, neutral experiences, and we'll talk more about feelings later. Then investigating our own mind, and then phenomena in general. So we are applying mindfulness to these 4 things to gain insight. And the 3 insights that we are focusing on or trying to gain here are these 3 insights into impermanence, suffering, and no self. So this is really the classic approach to Vipassana practice in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, through this 4 applications of mindfulness to come to these 3 insights called the 3 marks of existence. But before we go into that Vipassana practice of the 4 applications of mindfulness, let's step back a little bit and look at the larger framework that within which Vipassana practice finds itself. And so here we can talk about the 4 noble truths, the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And this is really the first thing that the Buddha taught when he achieved enlightenment. And to introduce these 4 noble truths, we can begin with a quote from a great Indian Buddhist master, Shantideva, from the 8th century. And he says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So I think we all have a desire to be free of suffering and a desire for happiness. And we strive for that, but often we end up just compounding our misery, our suffering. And the reason is that we really don't know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, what is happiness, and what are the causes of happiness. So if we want to overcome suffering and find happiness, we really need to know these 4 things. And this is exactly the 4 noble truths: suffering and its causes, happiness and its causes. And so to introduce the 4 noble truths, often it's introduced to help us better understand the 4 noble truths. We use an analogy, and the analogy here used is the analogy of a curable illness. So if we think we are sick, then what do? We tend to go to the doctor because we believe that the doctor is qualified to to help us to overcome that illness. And so when we go to the doctor, the first thing the doctor would do would make a diagnosis. And the diagnosis has two steps. The first is to examine what condition do we find ourselves in. So this may involve running some various different tests, blood tests and so forth, and checking pulse and checking all sorts of things to check what sort of condition do we find ourselves in. And then based on that, what condition we find ourselves in, then the doctor would go on to then try to determine what is the underlying illness that is presenting itself in this as this condition. So that is the diagnosis. And then the next step is prognosis. And here the analogy is curable illness. So the prognosis is that we can be cured. This illness can be cured. And then the fourth step, the next step rather, is the cure. So the doctor would maybe give us some medicine, or maybe we have to get an operation or something to cure the problem. So similarly, the Buddha is being like our doctor. That first, the Buddha is diagnosing what is the condition we find ourselves in. And so therefore, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. This is the part of the Buddha's diagnosis. And the second noble truth is the cause of suffering. Why are we stuck in this state of suffering? And then the third noble truth is the Buddha's prognosis, is that we can be cured from this state of suffering. We can be liberated from suffering. We can achieve a total cessation of suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the cure, Buddha's cure for us. And that is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. What sorts of practices do we need to do to achieve that liberation from suffering, the cessation of suffering and its causes? So let's have a look at these four noble truths in a little bit more detail. And we begin with the first of the four noble truths, the truth of suffering. Now, here the original term that's translated here as suffering in Sanskrit and Pali is dukkha. It's spelt a little bit different in Sanskrit and Pali, but same term. And so then often, based on this translation of dukkha as suffering, then we often hear Buddhist teachers say things like, according to Buddhism, all life is suffering, that the human condition is suffering, that all life is suffering. And then when we hear that, we often go, ooh, that doesn't sound right. My life's not always suffering. Yeah, sometimes I have a bit of suffering, but sometimes it's pretty good actually. So I think this Buddha guy, he didn't really know what he was talking about. And the problem here is the terminology. And that's often the case you find in Buddhism, is that the original Pali and Sanskrit terms had a very precise meaning, and that often there is no word in English that has that same precise meaning. And so therefore it's very difficult to translate. And most commonly here, this word dukkha is translated as suffering, but I think there is really no word in English that is really has an equivalent meaning to the term dukkha. And to appreciate that, we can look at the etymology of the word dukkha. This word dukkha we can divide into two parts. The du is coming from the root dis, meaning bad, and ka can mean space or hole. So dukkha sort of literally means sort of a bad space, meaning in terms of something not quite right, or a bad hole. And here, often we find in the etymology, the analogy used is that it's like the hole of a axle of a wheel of a wooden cart. And the axle's not fitting very well in that hole. So then we end up with a very bumpy ride, or the wheel's not turning very freely. So something's not quite right. So the etymology of the word dukkha means something sort of not quite right. And so therefore what we can understand is this word dukkha has a much more broader meaning than the word suffering. Because for us, when we hear the word suffering, we tend to associate the word suffering with unpleasant, painful physical or mental experiences. And the Buddha was certainly not saying that our whole life is simply unpleasant, painful, physical, mental experiences. that the human condition is dukkha. So to appreciate what that term encompasses, we can talk about three types or three levels of dukkha. The first is what's called the dukkha of suffering. And here we are talking about the unpleasant experiences. And so part of the human condition is, yes, in fact, we do sometimes have unpleasant, painful, physical, mental experiences. And so this is very obvious as part of the human condition. And then the second type of dukkha is called the dukkha of change. And this is referring to our pleasant experiences. And here the word change is used to describe our pleasant experiences, to help us to appreciate that in fact our pleasant experiences change, that they're temporary, they're transient because they're stimulus-based experiences. And so this one is not so obvious. And this is where we often go astray, is that we normally often, and we'll look at this tomorrow morning in more detail, is we often equate pleasure with happiness. And therefore, we end up with craving and attachment to our pleasurable experiences because we want to hold on to them because we believe that they're really going to give us some sort of lasting, genuine happiness. But I think you'll find that in actually most spiritual traditions, they really point the finger here in that to not have craving and attachment to pleasant experiences because it just leads to a lot of suffering. So this is not something unique to Buddhism. This is something quite, I think, in common with many spiritual traditions, that this craving and attachment for pleasant experiences just creates a lot of unnecessary suffering. But from a Buddhist perspective, there's something much deeper going on in the human condition than merely pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And that is what's called all-pervasive dukkha. And that is the fact that no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. That's what we need by all-pervasive. Our life is pervaded by the potential for suffering to arise at any moment in our life. So this is much less obvious, much more subtle. And to really appreciate this, we have to really appreciate the second noble truth, the underlying cause of suffering, that it's our mental afflictions. To really appreciate that as long as we have mental afflictions in our mind, as long as our mind is contaminated by craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, frustration, and so forth, then there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life, no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, no matter what's happening. So this is the deepest understanding of the word dukkha. So to help avoid the misunderstanding of using the word suffering as a translation term, some translators translate the word dukkha as unsatisfactory, that the human condition is unsatisfactory. So does that work? Does that fit that translation? Well, in terms of our unpleasant experiences, definitely unsatisfactory because we don't want them. What about our pleasant experiences? We could say that they're unsatisfactory as well because they're temporary, they're transient, they never last, and they're unreliable. And at the deepest level, we could say that the human condition is unsatisfactory because there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So the word unsatisfactory could work. So sometimes that's used, that term. So that's the first noble truth, that we are stuck in this state. That's the human condition of dukkha or suffering. Why are we stuck in that state? What is the underlying cause? So the second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. In Sanskrit and Pali, this is samudaya. And here the assertion is that the underlying cause of suffering, why are we stuck in this state of dukkha, is our mental afflictions. Mental afflictions here is a translation of the Sanskrit term klesha. Klesha is sometimes translated as disturbing emotions, afflictive emotions, and even sometimes some people translate it as delusions. But I think these translations are not so accurate because actually here a lot of kleshas are not emotions. In fact, I think in Sanskrit, Pali, and also Tibetan, actually there is no word for emotion. So actually in Buddhism, there's not really a lot of discussion about emotions themselves. From a Buddhist perspective, what is important, what is key, is not so much the verbal and physical displays, our emotional states, but what is driving those emotions, what is underlying those emotions. And that's the mental afflictions here. And so klesha is defined as a mental factor which cause the mind to become agitated or disturbed. And so therefore mental afflictions, I think, is a much more accurate term. They are mental factors which afflict, which agitate, which disturb the mind. And some examples, classic examples: attachment, craving, anger, hatred, jealousy. These mental factors, they agitate, disturb the mind. These are some cases, some examples of mental afflictions. In Mahayana Buddhist psychology, in the psychology here, Buddhist psychology, when we have a very extensive presentation, you can have a presentation of 26 mental afflictions, the so-called 6 root mental afflictions and 20 secondary mental afflictions. Then we can condense those down to simply the 6 root mental afflictions, here listed as ignorance, attachment, aversion, pride, doubt, and wrong view. And then a similar presentation sometimes is what's called the 5 poisons, listed as ignorance, attachment, aversion, pride, and envy. But all of these mental afflictions can be really condensed down into the 3 main core mental afflictions called the 3 poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So let's have a look at those 3 briefly now. Ignorance in Sanskrit is avidya, and is defined as a deluded state of mind that is confused about its object. And here in the 3 poisons, we're talking about a specific type of ignorance. We're talking about an ignorance that's confused about nature of reality. In fact, has a wrong understanding of reality. And here we can talk about these 4 distorted views, 4 types of ignorance: grasping onto things which are changing as unchanging, grasping pleasure as happiness, grasping no self as a self, grasping things which are dependent as independent. And then this is what is leading to attachment and aversion. And attachment is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's attractiveness and thus wishes to possess the object. Aversion, or sometimes here instead of aversion, we have a listed anger. Anger is a very strong type of aversion. And here anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. And so what we see here in attachment and aversion or anger is a couple of things. First is this factor of exaggeration and distortion, is that due to our ignorance of not seeing reality clearly, then mental afflictions exaggerate and distort because we're not seeing things clearly. And then we also see here that both attachment and anger, we talk about this intention to possess or the intention to harm, the wish to harm. So again, here what we find is that anger is not an emotion. Attachment is not an emotion. As we saw in the compassion retreat, both loving kindness and compassion are also not emotions. They're aspirations, they're wishes. And similarly here, aspirations and wishes, because this is what is driving our behavior, leading to all sorts of emotions and certain sorts of behavior. So what is key is not so much the emotion and the display, verbal and physical display, but what's driving that. And that's why we talk at that level of wish or intention, both in terms of the positive in love and compassion, and here in terms of the mental afflictions such as attachment and anger. And here we have this diagram we see in the middle at the bottom is called the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of life, which is really we'll look at this in much more detail in the next retreat, the one on emptiness. But this is really showing us, and we'll look at that shortly in the next slide, how we are stuck in this state of suffering due to these mental afflictions, particularly these three poisons. And if we go right to the middle of that diagram, we see it sort of blown up a little bit to the side here. The next picture, we see three animals right in the center of this wheel of life of Bhava Chakra: the pig, the rooster, and the snake. And these are symbolizing the three poisons. The pig is symbolizing ignorance, the rooster attachment, and the snake aversion. And here what we see is that the pig, out of the mouth of the pig is coming both, it's grabbing the tail of the rooster and the snake, symbolizing the fact that out of the mouth of ignorance comes both attachment and aversion. That it's due to our distorted view of reality that leads to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and the whole mess starts from there. And that process we'll look at in more detail later. So then if we complete the diagnosis, then what is the Buddha's diagnosis for us? Is that the human condition is dukkha, suffering, translated as suffering. The underlying cause, the underlying illness, why are we stuck in that state of dukkha, is because of the mental afflictions, specifically the ignorance, our distorted view of reality. That is the underlying cause of why we're stuck in this state of dukkha. The process is from that ignorance, from that distorted view of reality, we end up with attachment and aversion and all the other mental afflictions. That is driving our behavior, our actions, and that's leading to our current situation of suffering or dukkha. And that process we'll unpack that in a lot more detail in the next retreat, the retreat on emptiness. We'll look at those step by step in much more detail. So that's just a brief summary here. And that the Buddha's diagnosis is that we are stuck in this state of dukkha, not just in this life, but we are in fact cycling in this state of dukkha or suffering life after life. And that is what's called samsara. Samsara is a Sanskrit term. The sam prefix means thoroughly. Sara is from the root sir, means to go. So it means to thoroughly go round and round and round. So it's often translated as cyclic existence. So samsara is not a place, it's a state of mind. That we are stuck in this, if we're stuck in the state of dukkha, if we have a contaminated mind, then we're stuck in samsara because we keep cycling in this unsatisfactory state of suffering or dukkha. So this is the Buddha's diagnosis for us. And so then in the next session, then we'll go on to look at the Buddha's prognosis and his cure. So now what we'll do though is we'll go to the actual practice. So remember here, we are in this weekend retreat, we are looking at the foundation level of Vipassana practice, which is these 4 applications of mindfulness, that we're applying mindfulness to investigate 4 things. First, the body, then feelings in terms of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral experiences, then our mind, and then phenomena in general, to come to 3 insights: insight into impermanence, an insight into suffering or dukkha, and an insight into no self. So therefore, we begin at the beginning. And the beginning is we first apply mindfulness to the body to come to the first insight of impermanence. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a Vipassana practice, applying mindfulness to the body. So we're going to investigate the reality of the body, and we're going to do that through scanning the body. We're going to scan the body from the top of our head to the soles of our feet, and we're going to look, just observe the body. And it'll be on the basis of a question. So Vipassana means to investigate. And what we're doing is we're investigating our body on the basis of a question. And the question here is relating to the idea of impermanence, is that is there anything stable or unchanging in the body, or is everything changing moment by moment? One comment here before we go to the practice is actually when we see the word impermanent and permanent in Buddhism, generally when we often speak and we use the word impermanent and permanent, often we use the word impermanent to mean not lasting very long, and permanent means lasting forever. But that's not the meaning of the word in Buddhism. The word impermanent, coming from Sanskrit, nitya, or Pali anicca, literally means changing. So impermanent simply means something is impermanent if it's simply changing from one moment to the next. And something is permanent if it doesn't change from one moment to the next. So the word impermanent and permanent are not really telling us how long something lasts, because we can have impermanent things that last forever, and we can have permanent things that don't last very long. So it's just a matter of, is this thing changing from one moment to the next or not? And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to apply mindfulness to the body through doing a body scan and noticing, is there anything within the body that is stable, unchanging, or is everything changing moment by moment? And when we do these Vipassana practices, we are doing through direct observation. We are observing directly to see what is the reality of the object that we're focusing on. And we're not intellectualizing. We're not allowing the intellectual mind to make up ideas based on our intellectual understanding, but rather we're doing an empirical investigation, doing direct observation. So let's do that practice now. Let's do the apply mindfulness to the body through doing the body scan, coming to this insight into impermanence, to see if there is really anything in the body that's stable and unchanging, or is everything changing moment by moment. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And then at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. and preparing the mind. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And we can begin our Vipashyana practice by applying mindfulness to the body, to come to see the reality of the body. And so we can investigate the body by scanning through the body on the basis of the question, is there anything within the body that is stable and unchanging, or is everything changing moment by moment? So we can begin the scan by bringing our attention to the crown of our head and simply noticing any sensations there. And then slowly moving your attention down to the area of your face, noticing any sensations there. And moving your attention slowly around to the back of your head, noticing any sensations there. Moving your attention slowly down to the area of the neck, noticing any sensations. Moving across to the left shoulder, moving slowly down to the left upper arm, noticing any sensations there. Moving down to the left forearm, and down to the left hand. Right down to the fingertips, noticing any sensations. And then moving back up to the right shoulder, the right upper arm, the right forearm, moving down to the right hand, right down to the fingertips. And then moving back up to the upper back area, the area between the shoulder blades. The middle back area, and moving slowly down to the lower back area. And then moving back up to the upper chest area, noticing any sensations. Moving down to the middle chest area, down to the area of the stomach, and down to the abdomen. Moving across to the left hip, down to the left thigh, the left knee, moving down to the left calf, the left ankle, and moving slowly down to the left foot. Right down to the tips of the toes. Moving back up to the right hip, down to the right thigh, the right knee, Moving slowly down to the right calf. To the right ankle. And down to the right foot. Right down to the tips of the toes. And now noticing any sensations throughout the entire body. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So if anyone has any questions, you can switch on the webcam and the mic and ask your question, or alternatively, you can put it in the chat and Daniel can read it out for you. So any questions at all about anything we've covered in this session?
Hi, Glenn.
Hi, it's Ralph, yes?
Yes. I have a question to the meditation we just did.
Sure.
So I felt like a tickling internally, or sometimes like a bunch of ants. But then it's hard for me to understand, what do I really feel and what do I imagine I feel? You know, how can I avoid intellectualizing?
Mhm. Yeah. So, so that's why, I mean, in this sort of, we're doing an empirical investigation. So we need to be like an empirical scientist, meaning we're observing through our direct experience based on a question. So a scientist has some theory that they're trying to prove or disprove. So they have some question there, and then they just do their experiment. They just run it empirically. And leave their belief systems out of it, because otherwise it corrupts the experiment. So similarly here, and this even more so when we look at this no self, that often what can happen in these sorts of meditations is that the intellectual mind can come in and can pollute our experiment. For example, just in this practice here, we may be doing this scan, and then the intellectual mind might just come in and say, well, what are you doing this for? I know everything's in my body's changing. I mean, science has proven that. So yeah, I know that, sure. But then we're not being a scientist. We're just accepting our belief system, which may or may not be true. So here, Vipassana practice is talking about direct insight. So there's a big difference between direct insight and actually correct assumption. And also in same, we'll see that a little bit more in the case when we look at this no self. We do this no self investigation tomorrow, is it's very common that in that Vipassana practice, the intellectual mind just derails our whole meditation, because most of us tend to have some sort of belief in who we think we really are based on some sort of belief system. But we're not interested in belief systems here. We're interested in the facts, the reality. And so we need to leave those out and just look through direct observation. But that's why, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that to apply mindfulness here, to investigate, to apply mindfulness, first we need to cultivate mindfulness through the shamatha practice. Because otherwise, if we haven't strengthened our mindfulness, then we're not going to have any sharp tool of investigation. We're not going to be able to look very precisely at what's really there, because our mind will be distracted, it'll be dull, it won't see clearly what's there. And so therefore, what often happens also in these Vipassana practices is people don't really make much headway. And one of the main reasons is they haven't got the tool of mindfulness. They haven't cultivated that in shamatha. We saw that shamatha is really the basis of Vipassana practice. And so if we don't do that, shamatha practice, and we try to do this practice, we're probably not going to get very far. It's a little bit like, or we may have all sorts of funny results. It's a little bit like, a scientist who's running an experiment with faulty equipment. I mean, they may run it 100 times, may get 100 different results. So therefore we need functioning equipment. So if we want this or any Vipassana practice to go well, at least two things: leave the intellectual mind out, be empirical, and secondly, have some functioning equipment that we can use in the experiment. So you'll find that if we really work on improving mindfulness, then when we do this, for example, this body scan, we'll be able to see much, much more precisely what the reality is there. So that's going to be very helpful. So just focus directly on what's there, and don't allow for projections, our intellectuals, don't allow that to creep in and make up all sorts of theories about what's going on. We just want to be empirical. So that's important. Okay.
Excellent.
And one last point on that is also a scientist, if they're being empirical and they've got functioning equipment, they don't just run the experiment once. They run it many, many, many times, because they need to have repetition, repeatable results. So similarly for us here, we don't just run it once and go, yeah, I saw that everything in my body is changing all the time. That's not really going to lead to any significant insight. But if we keep doing this again and again and again and again, deeper and deeper and deeper, we can really have some very strong insights. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. I think it's coming up in the next session. Okay.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got time for at least one or two more questions. Any questions on chat? Hang on, we'll just go to the chat first and then we'll come back. We sort of alternate a bit. Is there any question on chat, Daniel?
Yes, Glenn, there's one question. Are the 3 marks of existence the same as the Dharma seals?
Dharma seals. There are, well, Dharma seals, there are, I think, what's called the 4 seals. And the 4 seals is the 3 marks of existence plus the result of nirvana. Is that what the person means by Dharma seals? The 4 seals?
I think that's what they're referring to.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can
Yeah.
just ask. Yes, that's what I mean. I think I thought that there are 3 Dhammasis, but you just clarified that there are 4. But the first 3 sound very similar. So I was wondering what the difference is.
Correct. Yeah, so here at the foundation level, we are coming to these 3 insights. These 4 Dharma seals were historically used to determine whether a particular text could be considered to be a Buddhist text. So if the text was saying everything's impermanent, in the nature of suffering, there's no self, and then that nirvana, which is the prognosis, which we're going to come in the next session, if nirvana is a state of peace, if the text asserted those four things, it could be considered to be a Buddhist text. So yes, there is a correlation there between these three marks of existence and those four seals, yes.
All right, great, thank you.
So then I think, who was next? Yes.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi.
Hi. I have two very quick questions. I
Sure.
hope we have time. Mental infliction. In Buddhism, we talk about mental infliction, and you mentioned that in the beginning of your presentation, which leads us to distorted view of reality. In layman's term, could we say that mental inflictions are same as our belief systems, almost like our ego?
Right. So we're going to look at mental afflictions much more detail, particularly we looked at some of them already in the compassion retreat, and we'll look at them more in the emptiness retreat coming up the next retreat. But what we're saying here is that it's our distorted view of reality. And this distorted view of reality is not some intellectual thing. I mean, we have wrong intellectual way of thinking, sure, but we're talking at a deeper level than that here. We're talking about instinctively seeing things in a wrong way. On top of that, we compound that even more by wrong intellectual way of thinking. But that wrong way of intellectual thinking, that's easy to eliminate. You know, that's relatively easy to get rid of. But much harder to get rid of is our instinctive false way of seeing things. And that's what this Vipashyana practice is about. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in terms of impermanence in the next session. And so the assertion is that it's our distorted view of reality, which is instinctive, and there are a number of ways in which we distort things, that is leading to mental afflictions. And again, mental afflictions can be based on that instinctive, but then also we can, through our wrong intellectual way of thinking, we can generate even more mental afflictions on top of those. But those mental afflictions that we have come through a wrong way of intellectually thinking, again, they're relatively easy to deal with. Whereas the mental afflictions, this sort of instinctive grasping to pleasant things, you know, attachment to pleasant things, instinctive, without thinking about it, that's not so easy to get rid of.
Yes.
And that's what we're talking about here. The craving and attachment that comes about because we've been fantasizing about things again and again, and then we have it, that we can, you know, pretty easy to get rid of. We just stop the fantasizing and then it's gone. But still, we have this instinctive grasping to pleasant things instinctively. And that's what we're addressing here. And we'll look at that in more detail later. So you had one more question?
Yeah, it's almost like automatic what you're saying, that it's we are grasping. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. I don't know if this is now we're going to cover, it was about impermanence and permanent. Beautiful description about everything changing. So everything is changing. But then I think I missed when you said about the permanent. Is there actually, it's been stable? Is there some examples you could give me? What's something that it's stable?
Sure. Basically anything that comes, and this is going to the question before, was these four seals. And basically the first one is anything that is created by causes and conditions is by nature impermanent, is changing. So there's nothing that is produced that is permanent. So the things that are permanent, not changing, are what's called negative phenomena, which is, and I won't go into it here because it's
okay.
Yeah. But basically anything that is produced with cause and conditions that is the first seal of Buddhism, is that is by nature impermanent, changing moment by moment. And the only permanent things are the ones are things that are negations, a negative phenomena. And the classic example of that is emptiness, that we'll be looking at in the next retreat, is that emptiness is a negation. It's a lack of independent existence. That lack of independent existence is not changing moment by moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So any positive phenomenon, i.e. created by cause and conditions, is necessarily impermanent. Any negative phenomena that is a negation, it's an absence, is by nature permanent, unchanging. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Maybe one more chat question and then we'll take a break if there's one more.
There was just a practicality about when the session started, so there's no more questions.
No question? Okay, then let's go to a break. So we'll take a break now, and we've got a nearly 30-minute break. So we'll come back at 10:45, so about 27-minute break we've got. And then we'll look at this impermanence practice with respect to the body in a little bit more detail. We'll complete the 4 Noble Truths presentation, and we'll also look at actually what do we mean by impermanence itself. So that's coming up in the next session. So until then, let's take a break, and I'll see you back in about 25 minutes.